Hello and welcome to another spoiler episode of Umineko. This will be the second last one for episode 3 of Umineko, which means that this is also when I'll be giving my final estimation of the what happened, who did it, etc. And then next week reading the spoiler comments people have been posting and seeing how I was wrong. This video is going to contain spoilers for the entirety of Umineko, so don't watch, don't listen if you have not played the whole thing. It won't make sense, even if you don't care about spoilers. And this is covering parts 15 and 16 of my Let's Play for episode 3, which means that it's basically covering the entirety of the final face-off with EVA-trice and Beatrice and Battler together fighting against her, as well as the one of my favourite moments of Umineko, the party and the moment where they do their heel turn as they try to compel Battler to sign and lose the game without even knowing what he's doing. But before we get there, we have some other stuff to talk about. There's the whole section where Jessica is blinded and is very vulnerable. And I think there's a kind of interesting point being made here where the unfamiliarity of having a sense taken away that she is used to relying on upends a lot of Jessica's ability to do anything in this situation, which you can extrapolate to everyone in this situation. Anyone on Rokkenjima suddenly having to deal with these unexpected murders is not capable of dealing with this situation because it's just so different to what they're used to, for the most part. Kyrie is maybe a particular exception to this, but I would even argue that Eva herself is not mentally prepared for enacting all of these murders. In terms of Eva's point of no return, it's when she accidentally kills Rosa and Maria, and she does not have a sense taken away. She does not immediately become blinded. But she irrevocably becomes a murderer in that moment, assuming she is the one who killed Maria, and there is no coming back from that. This episode has reiterated many times that when you break a vase, unbreaking it is impossible. Magic can defer the breaking to take blame off of you, but the act has been done, the vase has already been broken. And even if you temporarily repair it, that vase will break. When you become a murderer, when you become a killer, you are one. There is no undoing that. You can use magic to obfuscate things, you can try and use magic to potentially put the blame on somebody else or make someone else culpable for your actions, but at the end of the day, you've become one. And we see over the course of this episode, Eva does not take well to being one. And we will talk next time about the tea party, and Eva does not have a good time for the rest of her life. Going back to Jessica, the moment where she revives Kanon is very interesting to me, because Nanjo is right outside the room in the hallway being murdered by Beatrice, not EVA-trice, Beatrice. And in this moment, Jessica's panicking. She, despite her recent claims at taking down the culprit herself, she now feels very vulnerable. I don't think her being blinded is what makes her vulnerable. I think it is just a way in which her vulnerability is made extremely clear and unambiguous. If she had not been blinded, she would still be unsure and unable as to how she could fight back against the witch. But because she is blinded, it is so clear she does not know what to do. And she revives Kanon because she's calling out for people to help her. She's calling out regardless of whether or not those people are alive, because she knows her parents have died. As far as she's concerned, Kanon has died. She called out to anyone who she thinks could help her, anyone she trusts who could help her, and she calls out to Kanon. Specifically, it goes, "Help me, Kanon-kun," and then the narration says, "In the corridor, as the witch thought of how to toy with Nanjo's life, A single gold butterfly secretly watched that scene from the corner of the hallway. In this moment, Beatrice, having killed Nanjo, presumably fully killed Nanjo, hears that Jessica is still calling for Kanon. This is similar to with Shannon and George from the previous pair of episodes. This is the depth of Jessica's feelings bringing out Kanon because it pushes Beatrice more into understanding that there is love there. It does not necessarily fully convince Beatrice, which is why I think Kanon continues to have a time limit, aside from the bomb existing. But it pulls enough at Beatrice to have Kanon come out, and Kanon instead save Jessica, save her from the witch. Kanon knows he is on a timer. He knows he does not have a lot of leeway to do this. He needs to hide Jessica before the witch returns. By which he means the witch takes over his body again. And this is of course why Kanon is saying, "You cannot touch me." Because Kanon is presumably wearing, maybe not literally the Beatrice dress, but something that would not fit Kanon that also might be covered in blood. Or some other telltale indication of what that body has been doing. But another reason it's interesting that Kanon makes this distinction is he's insisting that his voice is what makes him Kanon, and that Jessica should focus on the voice to remember the person she has lost. Which is curious to think about for a person who exists as one of many in one body, who has been excised from that body. Kanon has been killed. He was resurrected by Jessica's love and by the sympathy that extracted from the witch. But at the end of the day, he does not get to use that body anymore. He has been killed. One quick note. He has an extremely ominous line. "I am also holding back my desire to touch you, milady." And I don't think that's a romantic desire that is being restrained. I think that's an allusion to what the witch would do if she had her way with Jessica in that moment. And in this moment where Beatrice, on the semi-meta magical level, is sacrificing what little she has left in order to resurrect Kanon for Jessica, again, it's an underlining of the fact that an endless witch cannot do this kind of sacrifice because she has endless power. It is the fact that Beatrice has been minimized to having limited reserves, that what she chooses to spend those limited amounts on makes a sacrifice more meaningful. Beatrice sacrificing herself to resurrect Kanon would be kind of meaningless if she would immediately revive again and just be like, yeah, it was no big deal. Even though she does continue to live. It's a little bit ambiguous to me if this is a surprise to her necessarily, but given how the episode ends, it feels like maybe this was not as huge a sacrifice as one might think. I will say a legitimate sacrifice on Beatrice's part is the amount of pain she goes through in order to basically distract and delay EVA-trice, in order to allow Kanon to finish having a conversation with Jessica and run out the clock until the explosion happens, presumably. Because EVA-trice again and again tries to ask Beatrice about her motivation, about why she would have this turn, why she would change after all this time. I think Beatrice refusing to answer this question is funny for two reasons, one of which is presumably she's hiding the fact that she is doing a bit of a long con on Battler in general, but at the same time, I think there is still a sincere lesson Beatrice is learning in this episode, and she understands that she simply can't impart that lesson by telling EVA-trice what she has learned. There are lessons that you cannot learn just by being told them. There are lessons you have to learn by experience. It's unfortunate that that experience doesn't necessarily come easily or pleasantly or airily enough, maybe before you murder your entire family. But Beatrice, I think, is also recognizing in this moment that she herself never learned these things when she was younger, and it has taken until now for her to learn them. And so, in a similar way, she is not able to teach these lessons by answering EVA-trice's questions. Because EVA-trice has demonstrated she doesn't listen to Beatrice anyway. So why would she listen to these answers? She would just ask them and then say, well, that answer doesn't make any sense. And then kill her. So instead, Beatrice withstands seemingly quite a lot of pain to draw out this scene in order to let Kanon and Jessica have a final conversation. Which, interestingly, we don't get. We only get Kanon eventually return and say they have finished talking. There may be an implication there that Jessica was killed in a much more gracious and kind way, or just that they had a pleasant conversation and Kanon understands that they have limited time. From EVA-trice's point of view, her interrogation of Beatrice's motivation is interesting. There's a funny contradiction happening in this, where EVA-trice is represented as a young girl, as a witch. Beatrice is represented as this mature lady, but in theoretical, actual experiences, they are the opposites. EVA-trice is the witch representation of Eva. So she is a full-grown woman who's had a child, who has a child who's grown up to being an adult. Whereas Beatrice is the witch representation of a person who is Battler's age. Beatrice talks about having existed for 1,000 years, but that's a very muddled, magical, complex situation. In terms of her actual behaviour, Beatrice is still pretty childish and can often lack knowledge of the world, and we've seen this repeatedly, in small hints that are often jokes. However, in terms of being the witches they are, EVA-trice sees herself as being Beatrice's successor. So in a sense, Beatrice is the teacher figure. There's a specific line from EVA-trice that I find very curious. As she's asking about why Beatrice has changed, she says, "You're such an incarnation of evil that I don't even rise up to your feet." Now, as far as EVA-trice has seen, Beatrice has actually been constantly tempering her cruelty. Okay, not constantly. Beatrice enjoyed the second Twilight, the magical display there. But even since finishing the second Twilight, Beatrice has done nothing but curb the crueler tendencies of EVA-trice and insist that she should be more restrained. All of what EVA-trice understands of Beatrice's cruel nature and her enjoyment of that cruelty, that all comes from stories she hears from Runaway, or tales she has heard rather than direct experiences. But more than that, this line to me sounds like an excuse. Not that she truly believes in Beatrice as this cruel figure that she can't even match to, as much as she's finding a scapegoat to say, there's someone much worse than me. I don't even rise up to her feet. She's done such cruel stuff. I'm just playing around. And this is a thing that happens with a topic we discussed many times in earlier episodes, generational trauma, where if you have an abusive father, for instance, and then you are abusive to your child, but in lesser, or quote-unquote lesser, ways, or perhaps different ways, you will still think of the demon of your father and how awful he was, and be thankful and glad that you are not there. You simply get frustrated with your child. But it's not as bad as how your father was an awful tyrant. And this is not learning lessons, because if you actually were learning lessons here, you'd be like, oh god, the trauma I suffered at the hands of my father is so bad, I don't even want to come close to doing that to my child. Instead, it functions as an excuse and just as a way to feel like, oh, I'm fine. you can ignore your own misdeeds because there is a boogeyman who was worse that you are not measuring up to. And the reason this is particularly relevant with EVA-trice is because EVA-trice as a witch is in itself a figure used to try and cope with Ava's inability to accept what she has done. EVA-trice is a fabrication that is distant from Ava the real person, so that Ava the real person doesn't need to deal with the consequences of her own actions. We see instances of Ava getting frustrated with other people and externalizing her blame onto them, as well as situations where Ava is arguing with EVA-trice, where Ava is a little bit more... where Ava is less murder happy and trying to tell EVA-trice to stop what she's doing, and EVA-trice is not her, and this is not the kind of person Ava could possibly be. And that's true in that EVA-trice does not represent the actions and motivations of Ava. It is an abstraction that is pushed to such an extreme it is clearly unbelievable. Ava did not by magic cruelly torture all of her family. However, Ava did accidentally kill Rosa and then with intent kill Maria. Those are real things she did, but instead of being able to cope with the guilt of that and trying to parse how much of it was intent, how much of it was an accident, how much was she pushed to the edge by her desire for the gold and the headship, her greed, instead she splits herself. She creates the exaggerated witch who cruelly just wanted to kill Rosa, the witch who contained all of her crueler tendencies. Any time she ever thought about being frustrated with her younger sister and wanting to punish her, wanting to enact revenge on her and make her know her place, all of that gets funneled into this witch character to an extent where it does not even match Ava entirely. In a later episode, it will be said that all of the characters on the game board act in character, and that's actually going to be important for a puzzle later. If you attempted to make someone act out of character, it stretches the boundaries of the game and can be pretty obvious. EVA-trice is a consequence of trying to push a characterization so far that it does not actually match the person anymore. And obviously, a person contains multitudes, different situations will cause a person to react differently. But even so, EVA-trice represents such a stretching of situations that it does not become plausible anymore, and she ends up being a different person. In part, that's because the existence of the witch EVA-trice papers over a missing, unexplainable accomplice in Beatrice, the person, which I will address more in the Whodunnit. But specifically this being a widely adopted public perception of what happened, it feels like a lazy and simple assumption that neatly ties things up with a mastermind with specific intent that is a lot easier to grasp than the very messy situation we will get to in 4 episodes' time. And I will conclude this long Ava pondering by saying that that's a lot of why Ava is particularly distraught by Beatrice's conviction to deny witches, because Ava wants to have this separation, because even if Ava, the actual culprit's motivations and actions were not as cruel as the witch's exaggerated state, Ava the human woman does not want to acknowledge the fact that there is not this separation, that this separation is false and is a way to distance herself from the true actions. Obviously, huge quotes around true actions, which we will get to more and more, but even so, there is a clear guilt that she does not want to have to acknowledge or engage with, and being forced to deny the concept of witches in general means that she cannot foist her actions onto other people. And we get to the battle between EVA-trice and Battler, with Beatrice supporting him, and There's some fun here with the fact that EVA-trice fights in a different way to Beatrice, and this will be interesting to think about more as we get to other combatants in the back half. But EVA-trice fights in a way where she is less concerned with the sanctity of the game, is maybe how I would summarize it. She uses an unusual attack that Renove himself, I believe, says that Beatrice is unlikely to use, which is that EVA-trice says, well, there's magic because this character acts in a way that makes no sense, so the only reason that happened is because of my magic. Which is the kind of thing Beatrice wouldn't want to do as the author, because Beatrice wants to claim that her story makes sense. This is a strange tactic in that you're basically saying, well, the yarn I've spun doesn't really make sense, does it? And then having the reader backfill, actually here is a clear and reasonable motivation for this character to have done the things she did. But all EVA-trice cares about is winning, so she doesn't really care about the fact that this undermines the story and makes it worse, and makes it sound bad if it's just like, yeah, why would Kyrie do this? Even though, because it is not actually a yarn spun by EVA-trice, there is a reason she did the thing she did, that is not magic, that is explainable, and that there is a perfect amount of evidence for Battler to draw out. Which is very fun. And I think this even goes into the final challenge, where Beatrice ultimately wants Battler to solve the mystery of the game. EVA-trice wants to win. Now, we've said a lot about how Beatrice could have easily won by now multiple times over and has continued playing against Battler because she enjoys playing and wants Battler to understand the game board more than she wants to best him. EVA-trice here is just playing for the win. That's why EVA-trice pushes so many red truths that it seems to create a checkmate that is unbreakable. And that the literally only way out of this particular puzzle would be to understand the game board. And Battler even almost gets there. Battler suggests a multiple personality theory that EVA-trice only cuts down by insisting that Jessica doesn't have multiple personalities, and then Battler does not pursue this line of thought any further. I'm not sure if, strictly speaking, saying it was multiple personalities would have entirely answered it, but it was the thread he needed to follow to get to the concept of Kanon and Shannon being dead, but their bodies still being active. But Battler's not quite ready for this yet. He needs a little more time to pull on that thread and puzzle through the game and start to come to that realization. And he's not there. The way Beatrice would play, she would taunt him with puzzles that are slightly out of his reach so he can grasp them and then gain more understanding. EVA-trice simply wants to crush him, so she just presents him with the hardest possible puzzle from his point of view. And even then, he could almost get there, but he needs more steps. And there's interesting lines from Beatrice where she almost does think he could get it. She begs him not to stop thinking. And specifically, Beatrice has a line where she seems a little bit distraught as she says, "Is it impossible? Is it really impossible for you, Battler? Please don't lose heart." She doesn't care quite so much about dealing with EVA-trice's puzzle here, as much as I think this is her worrying that he might never be able to understand her and the nature of this game. Because right after this, Battler is apologetically unable to think of any avenue to continue, and so Beatrice resolves to deny the witches with red. Which obviously has massive implications, because on its face it means that witches are simply fake. That if she can fully deny witches with red, then they don't exist at all. But of course, having finished the game, you have to think of the correlating position, which is that the red truth is not actual truth. The red truth is a version of truth. The fact that Beatrice can deny the witches in red does not deny her personhood. It means that, from the perspective of the red truth, witches and magic are non-existent. if this was an ultimate truth that was unassailable, then this game would of course be redundant. Or this game would all be a trick, only to try and convince Battler of something that's simply untrue. But it's neither of those things. It's that the red truth has limitations. In being something that is factually objective and correct, it in fact loses things that are real truths that are separate. Which we will come to with the golden truth in, 3 episodes time? 2 episodes time? And as Beatrice goes to deny witches with the red, there's a final moment between her and EVA-trice. EVA-trice is unable to imagine why Beatrice would give up incredible power, the gold, magic, everything. To which Beatrice says, "Even with magic to split the sea, there are some things you can never obtain." That's just the saddest line for both of them. Beatrice, who has lived 1,000 years, knows that she cannot obtain the life she wants. The miraculous fragment in which Lion exists. We will later hear, direct from Brent Castell, that is an incredibly unlikely situation that is nigh on impossible to reach, and that she had to hunt for a long time to find it. That is the universe Beatrice would want, but magic and gold won't find those things. And the other half of this tragedy is that Eva has not recognized that. Even in her older age, where she has maybe learned this, and she is bedridden and she is dying, Eva has perhaps learned this lesson, but far too late to do anything useful with it. She has found that having all of this gold and power and influence, it doesn't help her public image, it doesn't bring back her son, it doesn't bring back her husband, it can't improve the relationship between her and her last living relative who hates her guts. The power means nothing, because the power exists to compel people to do things. You can use gold to pay people and make them be your bodyguard, for example. But that is not what Eva needs, and as hypnotic as a mountain of gold is, it is not all powerful. It is simply overwhelmingly powerful for certain ends and utterly useless for others. You simply cannot spend money to make your public image better. And EVA-trice cannot fathom this. And this is a tragic moment for her, because had she learned this lesson, perhaps this weekend would have gone differently. After all, when someone solved the epitaph, in theory they could prevent the disaster of Rokkenjima by disabling the bomb. But evidently there is no universe in which that happened. And of course that takes us through to a scene I love that I don't have a ton to say about, honestly, where Battler's almost tricked, but it honestly feels like Beatrice and Virgilia are pulling back and intentionally not quite closing the deal here. Even before Anji jumps through the window, well, we'll get to that, even before Anji bursts in, they're tipping their hands by giving him creepy smiles to make him go, what's going on? I don't know if they, strictly speaking, would have stopped him signing, but they certainly started to break their quote-unquote characters in that moment, even before the full-on interruption happened. And of course, Beatrice is less interested in winning than she is in getting Battler to understand. So, even if he had signed, she would probably have theoretically taken that as a win, but then laughed at him and then played a fourth game regardless. One other just small fun note with this, Anji bursts in with the sound of breaking glass, which is actually very interesting that I've also been reading along in the manga, and in the moment where Battler challenges EVA-trice, he physically pulls her through a giant window that they use from the meta tea room as a screen to watch the game. So to explain this better, they're sitting at a table, that's the little... they're sitting at the little table where they have tea and snacks and so forth, and there is a huge window, and it's a very ornate window, the kind you would imagine in this fancy sort of place, that just shows the events of the game board as they're going on, and Battler physically reaches through the window, grabs EVA-trice from the game level, and pulls her to the meta level. The visual novel as written implies a crossing over there, but it's interesting how much more physical and blatant it's made in the actual manga. And it's similar with Ange here, where she is bursting through from one level to another. She's coming from the future to this place. And it's interesting how much bleed through this is going to start to introduce to the rest of the series. They are separate layers of reality that are starting to become perforated and are going to become so messy by the end of this whole thing. That is interesting because literally earlier this episode, EVA-trice said, I'm never going to meet this person. Why should I care? And then a few hours later, they end up having a face-off. That speaks to the meta storytelling themes that these layers being distinct does not mean that they are entirely removed from each other. You, as the reader, bring something of yourself to a book, even as the book brings things to you. And of course, the book universe is entirely separate from the real world, but even so, lots of things cross over because your thoughts and feelings will all influence your interpretations, even as the events of the book might influence your feelings and interpretations of reality. So these things are not isolated. These things are actually constantly influencing each other. And this is the beginnings of some very clear ways that these things will overlap and go back and forth. In a very messy way too, because one of them involves a 12-year time gap. Melissa, we'll get there. And so, that takes us to Whodunnit time. Now, I think it's pretty clear that Eva is heavily involved, but let's roll back and do a very brief run through of all the Twilights, because my theories have not truly changed that much, at least since the last episode. The first Twilight does involve real murders. Beatrice, in the guise of Shannon and Kanon's body, sets up the closed rooms, but survives, and they see her body, but then she leaves and can continue operating for the rest of the game. And because Eva is able to solve the mystery of the gold, she becomes Eva's accomplice. Eva, stressed and paranoid and pushed in a particular situation, accidentally kills Rosa in the second Twilight, and then either Eva herself or possibly Beatrice as an accomplice, seeing the situation that's happening, kills Maria in order to semi-enact the second Twilight, but also to basically hide the witness. The main reason that this may be Beatrice is that, in theory at least, Beatrice would be more prepared for the situation and able to go through with something like this, rather than Eva, who had just accidentally killed her sister without intent. The idea that Eva would immediately turn around and kill her niece by strangling her is difficult to imagine in one sense, even though I do have to say, if she was desperate and worried and just pushed by the situation, I could fully imagine it, and then have her immediately regret it. Because let me tell you, for the rest of this weekend, she is regretting everything that's happening, even as she continues. Then, as described by the VN, Hideyoshi had fully just served as an alibi for Eva. Kirie sees through this, sees the cigarette butt in the ashtray, and deciding to confront him about it, her, Rudolph, and Hideyoshi head for the mansion. Here's the part where specifics I am not going to delve into. but based on the argument that happens, Eva does go to confront them, and I believe also Beatrice, her presence there, is part of what tips the scales, because Kyrie and Rudolph are both people practiced with guns and ready for a fight. They know what they're doing. In a 2-on-1 situation, there's no chance that Hideyoshi could best both of them, and potentially not even one of them. In a 2-on-2 situation, I still think that would actually be somewhat implausible, especially because Kyrie at the very least would be shrewd enough to anticipate that it might happen, because she should be ready to suspect that Eva might be following them. What she would not be ready to suspect is that there may be further accomplices ready to attack them. This is the part where I would be willing to believe that they could be outdone, and I think magically that's represented by the fact that they fight the stakes and they beat the stakes, but then there are magical Chester Winchester sisters that they are not prepared for, and I think this represents Beatrice being present and being able to outgun them, because also Beatrice, someone has said way earlier that in the manga at some point there's a reference to the fact that Kinzo showed, I believe, Kanon, but maybe also Shannon, how to fire his guns because they would just shoot together. So Beatrice would have the skills needed to operate this gun comfortably. And then I do believe the explanation Battler gives, where it is not that Eva or Beatrice killed Hideyoshi, it is in fact that a not fully dead Kyrie or Rudolph managed to kill Hideyoshi in the aftermath. Which again makes sense to me, because when you have a shootout with people, they don't immediately just go down and die, and you're not always prepared for the aftermath. After which, it mostly gets pretty straightforward once you understand the existence of Beatrice. Klaus and Natsuhi get lured out to the gazebo and killed, probably by Eva and Beatrice together. Then Dr. Nanjo is killed by Beatrice while Battler is with Eva. A very minor note, I don't think the final moment of Eva point blank shooting Battler is actually real. The narration in that moment comes more from Meta Battler than it does from Game Board Battler. And the straightforward, cold-blooded shoot you and you're dead that comes from Eva feels a little bit off too. In a way that it's not... I'm not going to stubbornly insist that this isn't what happened, but it feels, again, a little bit neat and tidy in a way that doesn't quite match up with the events of the game board. Oh, one minor thing that I do need to clarify about George. I did look up future red truths from episode 4 and so forth. George did not go down the stairs or go through the front door. That is clarified in red truths later, so he must have in fact gone out the window as expected. So at that point, my suspicion has to be that Dr. Nanjo did indeed close the window behind him, because Dr. Nanjo is heavily hinted at being an accomplice. For starters, the first Twilight only makes sense if he is falsely claiming debts for all of these servants and Kinzo. Well, Kinzo's actually dead, but you know what I mean. And this is the kind of low-level accomplice behavior where he does not need to do much, he simply needs to see that the seal of the closed room has been broken and fix it. And he is best positioned to do so, and him doing so does not directly enact anything in particular. He is merely helping with the illusion, which he regularly does try to do anyway. He is constantly telling people, let's just leave it, let's not think about anything. It's just the witch, it's magic, the police will sort all this out in the morning, let's stop trying to fight each other. Because he is just trying to get people to fall in line with the magical narrative and not try to puzzle things out. So, in that sense, closing the window is just him going, no, nothing happened. There was no one left, no one got out. The seal was unbroken the entire time. And beyond that, I still think George went, saw actual Beatrice, similar to what I said with Kanon, had a moment of actually meeting Beatrice, after which Beatrice must have killed him, possibly to spare him the knowledge of what his mother had done, what Beatrice and Shannon were, the realities of the situation. There's an extent to which I think, as this episode goes on, where Beatrice is perhaps going along with being an accomplice because of the rules of the game she set up, but is perhaps not invested in anything long term. If indeed Beatrice is the one who kills Maria, one of her closest friends of the family, I think the spiraling from there would not be unreasonable. The first 2 episodes have presented Beatrice as a very powerful mastermind figure, but this episode, in the course of it in particular, has humanized Beatrice a lot more, showed her as more vulnerable, showed her as more of a person. And I don't think it would be unreasonable to say that there may be an interpretation here where Beatrice the person, while still being capable and prepared for a weekend of this murder game, was maybe less enthused and more distraught as things went on. And I think there's also the interpretation where George got to see Shannon for a moment, and in the aftermath was going to do something drastic, was going to push things in a certain way, was trying to do something that was so at odds with what Beatrice or even Shannon would want or would do, that it seemed like the best course of action was to end things sooner rather than later. Because again, as far as Beatrice is concerned, by midnight, most of those people on the island will not be surviving regardless. I do feel like specific motivations, particularly of Beatrice, may be a little bit off, so I think that's probably the biggest weak point I expect to be filled in as I read some spoilers and discuss those next time. But until then, look forward to the tea parties and my thoughts on them next week, as well as the reveals of what I missed for episode 3. But until then, thank you for watching, and see you next time.